The last interurban, and I'll define the term later, ran in the U.S. ran the year after I started at ended a year after I started at Northwestern University. And that was the Chicago North Shore of Milwaukee. Several interurbans, and I will mention them later, had kind of morphed into something else. But the true interurban in what I'm talking about finally terminated or finished in 1963. Okay, I call it a key transportation mode in the turn of the 20th century, and it's actually the end of the 19th century, but it is forgotten to a lot of people. Mainly because very few people rode on them. I know I've talked to several that have mentioned, yes, I rode on an interurban for this and that. I forget who I talked to, remembers as a child going from Danville, Illinois to St. Louis on the interurban, Illinois Traction Company. But not many of us did. As I say, I just missed out by a year. What is an interurban? Well, it was an electric railway. That's a key, that electric railway. It was not a steam railway. And it served multiple towns or special locations. And that first video actually went to Burnaby Lake in British Columbia, so that was kind of a special location. It's like a trolley or a tram, and it had heavier cars. It was the biggest difference. It also started about the same time that the streetcar system started in America. It was just a natural outgrowth. And it lasted approximately a half century. A few lasted to the end of World War II, but not many. Whoops, go back here. I know it went back, come on. How do you go back 1 year, Anderson? I'm missing it. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay. There we go. The first tram operations anywhere in the world, but here in the U.S., were horse-drawn. They provide, by the way, a tram ran on rails. It did not run on the streets. It wasn't a, quote, omnibus. Here's a picture of Seattle in 1884, but the first streetcar, or horse-drawn tram, dates back into about 1880, 1885. The problem, of course, with horse-drawn trams was, one, they were expensive to operate. It takes a lot of hay and a lot of cleanup and a lot of barn space. But also, horses had terrible problems trying to navigate a hill. And of course, Seattle doesn't have any hills. Okay. The last horse tram that I think of, maybe in the world, and I wish that with video here you could get a feeling for it, is in Douglas on the Isle of Man. And the video I showed here, or would have shown, it's actually me riding on it. The picture up in the right corner is an 1876 restored vehicle, not a replica, restored 1876. And I was privileged to have a backstage tour, so to speak, of the trams and the electric railway cars, restored cars, some of them dating back to the 1860s. Beautifully done. I mean, it just embarrassed everybody. Anyway, it was kind of fun, to be honest, because this was actually a route that went from the ferry to the electric railway, about a mile and a quarter. But it was fun just to be behind and hear the clip-clop as you went along. It was just a different experience. But anyway, you have to go to the Isle of Man to do this, which is in the middle, by the way, if you do not know the location. It's in the middle of the Irish Sea, about halfway between Dublin and Manchester. But a fun place to go, believe me. So anyway, come on. Get my... There we go. To get the power, and I'm going to use some terms, so I'd like to introduce those terms so that people are a little bit familiar. I used the term, for instance, catenary one day when I was talking, and somebody kind of looked at me cross-eyed and said, "What do you mean?" Well, there are two ways of delivering power. There's a third way, we can see it, the pantograph doesn't show up. it will in other pictures. The trolley pole, and that's where the name trolley came from. We have them on the electric trolleys, also known as trackless transit. I rode them all the time in Boston. There are 2 cities in which these still run, and those 2 are San Francisco and Seattle. One of the nice things about the trackless trolley or the electric trolley is it can negotiate hills, particularly in bad weather. Seattle tried to disband all these and found out to their sorrow that places like Queen Anne couldn't be served when there was snow on the road. But the electric bus or the trackless trolley went straight up. The second picture up on the right, upper right, is not a good picture, and you'll see better pictures. There is a catenary. And all this is a trolley wire suspended by another wire. And I should have brought a string to show you what happens. But when you suspend any kind of string between 2 points, it dips to the middle. And that's called a catenary curve. So the term just simply applies to the additional wire supporting the trolley wire. But the biggest difference is that under catenary, and it stiffens up the wire, one can get higher speeds. And if you look at the link, you'll see all why they can run at 50 to 60 miles an hour. The third version is called a third rail, and in the picture is a shoe that picks up the electricity. Third rail actually allows higher speed running, but it's not very good in the open. And I'll mention a little bit about why. But you can imagine in the countryside why a third rail may be not the best idea. But it was used, and used by a number of systems, including one from Seattle. The trolley is what we got today. This is an example of a very early Brill. Brill being a major manufacturer of trolleys in the world. And by the way, the left picture is a trolley. It's just if you're English, you know what I'm talking about. I'm sorry this one does not come up, because I had the pleasure of riding the number 28 tram in Lisbon, Portugal. Mary was not with me. It was a very hot day, and she probably appreciated not being there. It climbs some very interesting hills, comes down and makes some very interesting curves. I mean, like this. And but it's fun to ride. And it rocks, does everything you'd ever want a trolley to do. And it's, by the way, it's a very popular tourist attraction. Go here. Okay. Well, what were the advantages of the streetcar? Well, obviously, it could carry a lot of people, a lot more than a horse-drawn tram. It was usually faster than walking, but it had disadvantages. It had a fixed right-of-way. Maintenance of the electrical distribution systems, including wires, was expensive, and Seattle knows that from trying to keep the trolley bus wires properly set up. It's also subject to power outages. Just let a limb fall from the right tree and you've got nothing going. Or, as Link has discovered, let some people go get the copper cables off the wires and all of a sudden you're not doing anything. Seattle streetcars themselves date back to Frank Osgood. They said it was not going to work until, with passengers on it, the first one climbed James Street, which is an 11% grade. After that, they believed the trolleys had a low roll. It quickly expanded beyond the First Avenue line, and it began serving towns of Ballard, Wallingford, and Columbia City. So in a sense, it was an interurban, because they were separate towns. Hopefully the next one comes up. Let me go back a couple here. Okay, I missed this one. The earliest streetcar was Richmond, Virginia, at least streetcar system. And it dates back to an Annapolis graduate and electrical engineer, Frank Sprague. He designed the first system. However, he also invented two items which are critical today's transportation modes. First was the constant speed motor. This meant that regardless of the load that was placed on the electric motor, it could run at the same speed. And as a result, we have elevators. He is the inventor of the elevator, in effect. Otis comes later. It also provided what was known as regenerative braking. That simply means that you turn the motor into a generator. And what happens is that tends to slow things down because that work being done is slowing the motor down. That means you also can put power back into the lines. A very great example of the use of regenerative braking was here in the Rockies, both on the Northern Pacific and Milwaukee. I think I'm not sure, I have to go back. Anyway, they used electric, called Little Joes, to pull both passengers and freights across the passes, like the Marias Pass. And when they were coming downhill, they generated electricity that helped power the ones going uphill. Okay, other cities followed suit. In the state of Washington, we had both Tacoma in 1890, and there's a picture of a Tacoma tram. And then in 1889, we had Seattle, and that's a trolley or streetcar on Rainier Avenue. By the way, the Rainier Avenue lines are part of the current light rail system. It's the only at-grade running that light rail has, and it provides a lot of issues because automobiles tend to get in the way as well as people. Okay, let me go that. It's a little hard to see, but that's a streetcar map of Seattle in the early 1890s or late 90s by 1900. And you can see, if I can point it out here with this pointer, get it right. You can see up here, we're getting up to Ballard, to Wallingford and Ballard, and down here to Columbia City, and down to South Seattle. So anyway, they were already in working here. There was obviously a disadvantage with streetcars. This is State and Dearborn. By the way, it's a real picture. State and Dearborn in 1910, about 1910. Nobody's going anywhere. So if you were on the tram, you might as well get off and walk. And that actually would happen in downtown, where people would actually get off the tram and just go walk. Okay. The early interurban railways. Again, it's a term, a definitional term, and again I'll go through it, but anyway, the early railways were really centered around major cities, Chicago, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and Seattle. They were easiest to build on level right-of-ways. That's one reason why the Midwest had so many interurban railways. The Great Lakes particularly, along the Erie Canal and Hudson River. In the West, Seattle and Portland, they were along the rivers, and in Los Angeles along the coast. Indiana and Ohio led the way with the most mileage. Now, according to 1916 statistics, there were approximately 15,000 miles in the U.S. And they carried between 30 and 40 million passengers annually. Ohio had the most mileage at 2,800, and Indiana's second at 2,800, Indiana's second. This is a picture of both Ohio and Indiana interurban, but I want to point out a little interesting difference in this picture. Find the right point up here again. You can see Indianapolis, it's a spoke system. Everything originated in Indianapolis. At some peak time, they were carrying 25,000 passengers daily. And then along Lake Michigan. Ohio and other words were the major cities. Toledo, Lima, Springfield, Columbus, Dayton in the middle, and way back down to Cincinnati. So Ohio's system was more interconnecting the larger areas. The system initially used trolley cars, but they were not satisfactory, not only because of comfort, but also for speed and for long distance travel. The early trolley cars had only 2 axles. The later one, the interurbans almost always had 4 axles. Although all had overhead, most had overhead trolley, where some ran on catenary. And I'm going to, unfortunately, this is another slide video. The exceptions to the overhead were Sacramento Northern, Philadelphia and Western, Chicago North Shore and Milwaukee, and that was in basically the North Shore was on the loop in Chicago. And some of the Seattle Tacoma ran on third rail. Videos here. The biggest contribution to trolley systems that came late in the interurban life, unfortunately, was called the Electric Railway President's Conference Committee car, PCC. It would, and if you've ridden streetcars almost anywhere, and a lot of places in the world, you've ridden on a PCC car. That used to be the standard Boston, we call them subways in Boston, but that was the standard streetcar in Boston that I always rode. Washington D.C., Philadelphia, I'm sure Seattle had them too. 5,000 were built for the U.S., and 15,000 worldwide. Okay, interurban travel was mostly for shorter trips between rural and urban areas. I call it interurban because often it served 2 cities. Some of these interurbans provided parlor cars, now are first class. Longer lines, such as the Illinois Traction, actually had sleeper service between St. Louis and Peoria. What they were doing, and actually in some cases putting out of business the railways, because for shorter distances, a railroad could not compete. And at the height of the service, it was possible to go from Milwaukee to Boston by interurban. Maybe I might have tried it, but I doubt it. It's about a 5-day trip. I think I figured it out. But it was possible. Okay. There's no obvious interurban starting date. We think, or the history thinks, the first interurban ran between Newark and Newark. Is that correct, Mary? Newark, because I always want to pronounce the New York term, Newark, to Granville, and it was about, I missed it, 7 miles, about 8 miles. The reasons is that are that rural population wanted better access to the cities. If you think about it, how long would it take to walk from the Northwest UW Medical Center to here? It's about 3.5 miles. Well, on foot you might make it in an hour in those days, but certainly with ox cart or cart and horse, you couldn't make it in less than 2, less than 2. And so that was a trip. Nowadays we can do it in 15 minutes, big difference. Of course there were bad roads. If roads existed, just let there be a little bit of rain, and everything got bogged down. There were no vehicles. The obvious solution was to begin expanding trolley lines, which happened, and often in another urban area. And as I say, interurban here is always going to refer to electrified trains. And I learned later that the term interurban was coined by Charles Henry, a state senator in Indiana. That's a little bit of trivia case. Anders is making another trivia. Unfortunately, I'm going to miss a video, but anyway, the largest was Sacramento Northern. That was the largest, one of the largest one. It had the longest point-to-point service from Chico to Sacramento. It was third rail from Sacramento North and catenary to Oakland. Oregon Railways had both the Oregon Electric and the Southern Pacific Electric, which was called the Red Electric. And other systems that were important, I mentioned, were the Illinois Traction and Texas Electric, both about 170 miles. While the Chicago North Shore and Milwaukee system was not long in terms of total length, it was the fastest of the system overall. They claimed they could make the run, in fact the timetable showed the run from Chicago to Milwaukee, 90 miles in 90 minutes. That includes stops, by the way. There weren't such things as crossing gates. And there were a few issues there with automobiles. The most extensive was the Pacific Electric Railway, and it was known as the Red Electric. If I come to it here, because of the color of their cars. It was an amalgamation of many shorter railways. By the way, most interurban started as somebody's desire to have a railway, and they found out very quickly that it took money, and they went broke. So these little railways got collected together. Henry Huntington, who was vice president of the Southern Pacific under his uncle, Collis Huntington. And Huntington was one of the big four. Huntington, come on, let's go. Okay, the name just went by me. That were out of San Francisco. They were also the builders of the Central Pacific, which met the Union Pacific at Promontory Point in 1869. It served Los Angeles and Bernardino, and connected Los Angeles, Orange, Bernardino, and Riverside counties. It was initially developed for tourism, but later they discovered that real estate was a critical part of it because you could provide transportation. And that's always been about what railroads have been about, is providing not only transportation, but real estate, building along. And if you look at the land grants to build the transcontinental railways, that was all about building. Okay, Seattle. We had two of them. One was the Puget Sound Electric Railway. Technically, first was Ballard, Columbia City, and Wallingford, but it really became an interurban when they went to Tacoma. The first was a narrow gauge, the Grant Street Railway, which ended in Georgetown in 1893. The developer went broke. Later, taken over by Stone and Company, it went via Renton, Fife, and then into Tacoma by 1903. It carried approximately 3 million passengers at peak time around 1916. It last ran in 1928. It was street running through a lot of Seattle and street running back into Tacoma. I mentioned it was third rail for a lot of it, and third rail in the country had certain disadvantages called wildlife or cows. Those are 600-volt rails, and of course a cow or a deer or anything can't tell that that's a live rail. And getting the dead carcasses off the tracks was one item that the motormen and brakemen had to do. The Seattle Electric Traction Company, or Electric Railway Company, its first segment reached Hall Lake and finally completed in 1910. It carried a lot more passengers than Puget Sound ever carried. Here's some of the equipment that was used. The Puget Sound, you can see what a car looks like. The cow catchers there were even more important than cow catchers on other ones. Seattle Everett, there's their car, heavier car. Again, you can see they're fairly large cars, particularly if I showed a picture of the trolley. And the interior seating looked like that, fairly comfortable compared to a trolley or a streetcar. It's hard to see, but this is a timetable from the Puget Sound Railway. And you can see that there is a train leaving every half hour, either for Tacoma or back from Tacoma. I'm sorry I could not find an individual schedule. I looked and looked and looked. But there are about 12 or 13 stops on that schedule. But it was the ability to do it every half hour. And it took about an hour or so to cover, an hour and a half to cover the 30 miles. This is a list, actually, of the cities they serve, because this is a ticket. And you can see, starting from the terminal, which was usually Grant Street, down to the Tacoma terminal. And if you want to do some counting, and I forgot to do the counting, how many different cities it served along the way. By the way, most of these cities were served by what is known as a flag stop. A flag stop simply was that a passenger, by some means or another, indicated to the motorman or the driver, depending on who you want to talk about it, from the British term, it's called driver, that they wanted the train to stop. So the train would stop, pick up the passenger, or passengers wanted to depart, much like we have here on our bus system. They effectively are flag stops. If one ever spent time, I've spent time on the buses, they skip stops if there's nobody there. Anyway, so that's how most of these stops ran. Therefore, the train starting in downtown Seattle certainly didn't stop at every station on the route. Okay, 1916, things went downhill, started to go downhill. In fact, 1916 is considered the peak of interurban travel. By 1930, less than 5 million people were on board. That's down from 30 to 40 million. Most of the systems had actually been disbanded by 1930, and almost all finished off by World War II, with a few exceptions. The Puget Sound, as I said, stopped operating in 28, and Seattle Everett in 1939. Now, some lasted beyond the war. They started carrying freight, and there was a good reason for freight, because there was a need to get freight from the urban area out to the rural areas. So either they had a special freight service, which the North Shore tended to have, that hauled actually equivalent of freight cars with various loads. So if you wanted to get the fertilizer, or the seed, or the desk, or the Sears building to some rural location, you could use the interurban to do it. And that gave them enough revenue so that many were able to keep going after World War II. Illinois had three that lasted 50s and 60s. The Illinois Traction, or Illinois Terminal as it became. Illinois Terminal now is a regular railroad. The South Shore, which now is commuter rail. I don't have a picture of it, but it's what we call commuter rail. It's heavy duty equipment. And then the CNS-M, Chicago, North Shore, and Milwaukee, lasted until 1963. Well, part of the, and it's my history too, part of the North Shore tracks were then put into use by the Chicago Transit Authority, CTA, to go from Howard Street, which is the loop, at beyond the first stop, big stop after the loop, out to Skokie. It was called the Skokie Swift. It first ran 60 years ago. And it so happens my thesis is on the ridership of the Skokie Swift, so I rode the first one. It's hard to believe 60 years ago I did that. It was an interesting experiment because I was able to show how a high-speed, not necessarily high-speed, it was high-speed, but how a basically non-stop system could take about 8 miles and have a lot of attraction for automobile drivers. So it worked, it's still running, it's all been converted from trolley, catenary to third rail. When it first started running, when you got to the end of the third rail portion outside Howard Street, you had to get back out and put the trolley wire up. They changed that to what I'll show as called a catenary. You didn't have to do a pantograph, and I'll show a picture of those. They found right away, in fact, at my first ride, I remember it happening. The pantograph, because of the speed, they were running 60, 70 miles an hour. Because of the speed, the pantograph would bounce off the wire. And finally, some engineer decided, gee, you know, I put an airfoil on that pantograph, I can keep it against the wire. And it ran much better after that. Nowadays, it springs to the same thing. Well, how did it change lives? Well, it allowed the urban dwellers easy access into urban areas. It provided access to activities such as parks, lakes, and amusements. The greatest amusement park or amusement area, best known one, is Ravinia out north of Chicago in Highland Park. Mary and I attended numerous concerts there over the years. It's still operating as a concert zone, and it was built by the North Shore to take people somewhere on the weekends. Other places, there were amusement parks. I did have a list now, but there were amusement parks, the same thing. Down in Portland, for instance, Oaks Amusement Park, which is now really part of Portland, The first amusement park west of the Mississippi was built by the Portland General Electric. It supplanted inefficient steam trains for shorter trips. Think about a steam train trying to go a 3-mile trip. It'll take almost as longer to get the thing started and ended, stop. And it provided, as I said, local freight traffic over the time. Okay, end of the era. Well, the reasons are, and I should have made that larger print, I don't know why I didn't, are the automobile, the coming of good roads, and the bottom right, I think it's like a picture of a road, of a highway outside of New York, I think, and buses. By the way, there's a myth going around that the buses got rid of the trolley system and light rail in Los Angeles. It had nothing to do with GM, although they say it was a GM plot. Just too many of the light rail or interurbans were poorly located and hastily constructed. And of course, depression didn't help things. And finally, riders changed in their habits and preferences. So the automobile took over as a way to get places. Of course, the era ended. I want to explain that picture more. I love the picture. I've taken it many times. It's a perfect place for this. The Chicago South Shore, this is the encore, so to speak, became a standard commuter line with commuter cars. The Philadelphia Western now become the Norristown high-speed line. It has a small single car built for higher speeds between Norristown and Philadelphia, North Philadelphia. Some of the systems, the MBTA or the old MTA, I'm not going to sing the song, had the Riverside line and the Mattapan high-speed line, and Chicago expanded their streetcar system. These are all considered hybrid systems. However, in between, we're getting highway overcrowding and air quality issues. And so to do something, knowing what happened before, systems required separate structures with no intersecting roadway. Now, except for short segments, that's true. The short segments are downtown Portland with Max, which is a real pain. They wanted to put it under the ground. Somebody discovered it takes $4 billion to do it. And Rainier Avenue for the light rail. And the big problem there is interaction with people and cars. And with a heavy piece of equipment, that interaction is never good. Okay, the light rail. The first modern system, the San Diego trolley in 1981, and Mary and I have written it, they coined the term light rail. And what it simply meant is it handled fewer passengers, not the rail itself, although some rail is lighter than the standard rail, but it was fewer passengers and they could go in shorter and have shorter train segments. In many cases now, they've integrated with a much larger system. Boston, Cleveland, and other systems. In the Northwest, the Portland Max in 1986 now has more extension than the Seattle system itself. Max now is the airport, Gresham, and out towards where we lived in Hillsborough area. The link is great separated, as I said, except Martin Luther King between Columbia City and Rainier Beach. There's a picture of the Rainier one. Now, this here, and I'm going to hopefully be able to show it, right? Where am I put this sucker? I put out my tool. There it is. Anyway. What I want to point out on this one, if you look up at the top picture, first of all, the pickup is called a pantograph. That was supposed to be in my pictures, it wasn't there. And that's the same as a trolley pole, except it's able to slide back and forth on a wire, which a trolley pole had problems. The trolley bus and the trackless transit in Boston was particularly notorious for that pole popping off the line. I can remember many a time going through an intersection where it was crossing other lines and the pole popping off. That ended the ride right at that point until the driver got out and put it back up. But it usually happened in an intersection, so it wasn't a good idea. I've noticed here, I've been on 2 different times when the pole has come off. These buses have batteries, so they can operate for a long distance without the pole. Nowadays, there are about 16 major light rail systems in the U.S. So what happened to the roadbeds? Well, almost all were removed or paved over. Some states converted abandoned interurban lines to walking paths, and some were paved. States with known paths include California, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania. Notice that Texas is absent from this. Texas did not convert paths at all. In Illinois, there's the Green Bay Trail, which I've walked numerous times. In Minneapolis, it's called the LRT, Light Rail Trail, Tri-Rivers, which I've walked a lot. And Seattle has one of the longest sets of interurban paths. We have both the north, which starts at about 107th Street, I think, and Greenwood, somewhere up there, and continues all the way up to Linwood. It was first conceived in the 90s, and then to Colby Avenue in Green Everett, about 31 miles. The southern path follows the Puget Sound Electric Railway, first opened in 1984, now connects Tukwila, Kent, Auburn, Algona, and Pacific. So those are the 2 paths, and when you look up interurban paths, rail paths, you'll come up with these 2 right away. Okay, what about the Burt Gilman? I was under the impression for a long time that it was originally a rail line that had been converted. I came here and people convinced me that it was a light rail line converted. Well, that's not correct. And as Ron, who is the light rail, the trails to rails expert around here can tell you, it's a paved over but roadbed that belonged to a railroad. And it actually comes from Burke and Gilman, Seattle, Lakeshore, and Eastern Railway, which was intended to connect Canada with the Northern Pacific here in Seattle. The trail follows much of the original roadbed from Seattle, Lake Forest Park, Kenmore, and Bothell. The Northwest Railway Museum in North Bend, if anybody's been to North Bend will see the museum and the steam engines. That's part of the old roadbed. So, that's kind of it. Anyway. I hope that answers the question.
In World War II, I could walk 2 blocks to Santa Monica Boulevard near UCLA and catch the red line to visit Grandma in Orange County in Santa Ana. And another anecdote, my father-in-law taught Spanish. He had a cute blonde in his class. A couple of quarters later, they went into each other when she was transferring to the interurban to go back to Everett. The rest is history.
Okay.
Just a quick comment. When I was in Crimea in 2005, there is an interurban that goes between Simferopol and Yalta. I can't remember how long it is, but at that time they said it was the longest in the world. It runs right alongside the highway. I think it's electrified. In Crimea, Ukraine.
And response, I did not concentrate on the rest of the world. There are a lot of interurbans around the world, thank you. But I just wanted to stay right within the U.S.
Sure.
How did the interurban companies deal with roadways and right-of-ways at shared intersections with automobiles?
That I would have to really spend time with Fred and look at maps. But it was the intersections were the real issues. And right nowadays, cars turning left, especially right into link trains, is a real problem along Rainier Avenue because the driver is not expecting, regardless of what the gates tell that driver, is not expecting that train. And anybody who knows physics knows that the two masses are very incompatible.
That's okay.
Yeah, well, my rail trail expert here.
Yeah, and then Al.
Well, certainly, even the main railroads ran often right through a town, and you had to wait maybe 5 minutes for a long freight train to pass before you could cross the tracks, and that led to the large construction of bridges that would take local roads over the railroads and replace grade crossings. And that added to the expense of the highway system.
Next is Al.
Yeah, I grew up in Fort Collins, Colorado, been a small town with a streetcar system. And probably in the 1940s, the city council was getting enormous pressure, primarily from Detroit, to get rid of the darn things and replace it with automobiles, which they did and then later really regretted. There was a median strip between roadways on each side, and they planted trees on it. And then when they decided we'd like to reinstitute the streetcar system, there were all these damn trees in the way. And then the second point, the College of Forest Resources had an old steam locomotive, a kind of a logging era locomotive, on its premises on the campus. And then they were taking the rails out of what became the Burt Gilman Trail. And so they were in a panic to get the darn thing operating again and onto the rails while they still existed. And they got about a quarter mile down the track before it pooped out. Was there for a couple of weeks before they could move it on out.
By the way, I was docent in this shirt happens to have pictures. There are three large steam locomotives, two of which are operating. One of the second largest operating locomotive in the U.S. It first belongs to Union Pacific. And the third is a 1912 locomotive being rebuilt, and they just got donated what's called a logging locomotive called a Shay, and that one they're going to get into operating condition within about a year or so. So hopefully they'll have 4 operating steam locomotives that actually can run on rails between here. The big downfall for Portland was we had no railroad to run on, and Union Pacific said, no, we don't own the equipment, you can't use this. That was an unfortunate event. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Another comment or two, the streetcar system in Fort Collins had a single wire, and so the current was in the rails and in the wire. And a favorite stunt of the teenagers was to go yank the wire off the trolley off the wire. And now we have electric buses with 2 masts and 2 wires, and they don't seem to have much trouble keeping the things on the wires. Occasionally you see a driver getting out and repositioning one.
Well, you need the second wire because it's direct current, and you need a return somewhere, which the trolleys use the rails to do that purpose. But as I say, it's a more expensive system to maintain, of course.
That stirred up some old memories for me. I remember the old electric trolleys, Seattle Transit, and it seemed like about every other, I started riding them when I was young, when I was about 8. It seemed like about every other trip, the driver would have to get out and put the pole back onto the wire. And I also remembered when they switched to diesel buses, and boy did everybody complain because they had the exhaust in the earlier buses coming right out between the tires, and if you were behind one, you got an awful, awful nose full of bad smell, and then they started piping it up. So it did nothing for the air quality, but you didn't get a face full of diesel smoke. Around.
I have stories about it, I won't go through them.
In Philadelphia, the local transportation authority has very recently resuscitated a group of the old PCC trolleys, the Girard Avenue group, and they become quite popular. I think they are still fairly efficient to run, but it took a lot of time, effort, and money to bring them back to life with some modern upgrades.
Well, just to add a little bit to what you said, Ron, working on these older pieces of old equipment, it's not cheap. Ours was less, cost a little bit less than that, but I was talking in one of my days, I was talking with a fellow from the Kentucky Rail Museum, and they were restoring an engine such as our large Union Pacific, and they said their cost was going to be about $3 million to get that thing back and running. So these things look like toys, but they're not cheap, believe me.
Was the purchase of these systems legitimately done, or is there anything you could say about that process of removing them?
That I can't really say. I concentrated more on the building of them instead of, hey, they got taken apart. If your question is was it legitimately done to take them to spend? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I know when the Seattle system was, the Seattle streetcar system was purchased, there was a lot of complaint that Ole Hansen had overpaid, the then mayor had vastly overpaid for the system that they bought, and there's always the question of honesty in such an event. And then, of course, the removal in the 1939, 1940 era has often been blamed on General Motors. So I don't know enough about this to know what happened in specifics.
Well, of course, General Motors was the biggest supplier of buses, although there were a lot of other companies. And I think some of it, yes, I think General Motors got into the act more than once to get their buses sold. But it was not a plot, so to speak, that I can read about of General Motors to remove these systems. That's the standard word, but you know how the kind of urban myths grow anyway. So that I can't answer, Paul, directly. But I agree that some of these systems and some of these purchases were overpaid, but that was because friends were operating them. That wouldn't happen in the political climate today, would it?
Like friends of the mayor?
I'm not going any further.
Big campaign contributor. Yeah, what, really? Anyone else?
Well, thank you for coming.
Back here. Oh, wait, very much, okay. You get to have the last word.
Okay, Paul.
I just wonder where you fit bullet trains in the progress of rail. But bullet trains, East Coast and California bullet trains.
Oh, the
bullet
super,
train, I'm
super
sorry.
fast, yeah.
Well, I'm not gonna go there. It's not worth it. For a whole host of reasons, it's not worth it. I just think it's a fun idea that just nobody ever thought about how it really would work in the end. And so there's about a lot of money dumped into it, and it's going to be a rail system from nowhere to nowhere when it's all finished. I mean, that's all I can say. It would make more sense, and the talk is very serious, by the way. It would make more sense for, I call it not bullet train, but a high-speed rail between Portland and here. It's going to take a lot of money. They're going to have to drill a lot of tunnels. But it is not impossible to make the running time between here and Portland in much less than 2 hours. In fact, you can probably do it in about an hour and a half. So it makes sense here on the West Coast just because we have two relatively close cities and a reasonably level roadbed grades to work on, a few tunnels. But California, it's more political issues there than anything else. They could have gone from San Fran to Los Angeles, but the powers that be don't want them to go into San Francisco, and don't want them to go into Los Angeles. And that's really a big problem there. And by the way, just an aside, we rode a TGV in France, and we know what happens when you kind of have a hybrid system. We went from Paris to Le Mans in about 48 minutes. That was an old 3-hour ride, 2-hour ride, and then got on the regular rails because they hadn't extended the antique system portion, and it took another almost 2 hours to get the rest of the way to Nantes. Nowadays, that whole trip is in the neighborhood of about an hour and 20 minutes. So it's a big difference when you have to put the two together, and that's what they're trying to do in California. They're trying to merge two systems, and you got the last ends of those systems. They aren't going to work well. But I agree there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry about the video.